Hey guys, what's up? So I've been getting asked a lot on how I study so many similar languages without confusing them, so I thought I would give you some tips that I find extremely helpful, and hopefully you find helpful too. Thank you for watching. So one thing that I do suggest is to wait until you reach a certain fluency in one language before starting another. So do not start learning two similar languages at the same time. Although for some people they don't really have a problem with confusing similar languages, but this has worked the best for me, and I've talked to other people and it has worked the best for them as well. So for example, I've been studying Spanish for about 4 years before I started studying Italian, and it took me about a year to reach the same fluency in Italian as I had in Spanish, and that is when I started studying Portuguese. And the reason why it's good to wait until you reach a certain fluency in one language before starting the other is because it prevents confusion, and this helps separate the language because you already have reached a certain fluency in one and you already know how to communicate in it well, and it takes you less time to start thinking and translating, and it just comes more naturally. So once you already have kind of a good worked up consistency in one language, when you start the other, you're not going to have a lot of confusion because they're already starting to separate on their own. Although at first maybe you'll have a little bit of confusion, but don't get frustrated. It's just something that's natural. Now, another thing I do recommend is to make a schedule. So what I mean is that study one language in the morning maybe and studying the other in the evening, because there's enough time in between that you had enough time to process each language before switching to the other. So now if you're still mixing up languages, for example, let's say you're studying Spanish in the morning and French in the evening, but you're still having trouble mixing them up and remembering which is separate, then what I recommend is picking certain days of the week to study these languages. So for example, maybe on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays you study Spanish, and maybe on Thursday, Fridays, and Saturdays you study French. And this just kind of helps separate the languages as you go, and eventually it will get a lot easier, so you won't have to have separate days for each one, and things will just start coming a lot naturally. So another thing that I like to do is finding patterns. So what I mean by that, and I mentioned this in another video I made on how not to confuse Spanish and Italian, and I'll just put a link to it in the description if you want to check it out, is finding maybe word patterns, for example. So for example, in Italian, words that end in A with an accent end in dad or dad in Spanish, and in Portuguese they end in dage or dade. So let me give you an example. The word for city in Italian is città, so it ends in an A with an accent. Now in Spanish, the word for city is ciudad, ends in dad. Now in Portuguese, the word for city is cidade, so it ends in dade. So now some of these patterns may not work 100% of the time, but in most cases I find that they're extremely helpful. So when I'm speaking, I can remember the differences and I won't mix them up as easily. Which brings me to my next tip, remembering their differences rather than their similarities. So what I mean by this is differences like spelling, pronunciation, or accent. So I'll give you another example. The word for sky in Italian is cielo, but the word in Spanish is cielo. So now they're spelled the same, right? But you can remember these because they are pronounced differently. And with accent, for example, so Spanish and Portuguese are very similar. They look very similar on paper or in writing, but their accents are totally completely different. So maybe that's one way that helps you separate these two languages in your head. So now my final tip is to think in one language at a time. So what I mean by this is when I switch from studying one language to another, I like to forget my other languages. So what I mean by this is that, let's say I'm studying Italian, I like to not focus on what I know in Spanish or what I'm learning in Portuguese, and I just focus on everything in Italian. And I try to use as little English as possible as well, so I try not to think in English at all if possible. And at first it's kind of hard, it's just something you have to ease into, and it slowly becomes more naturally the more fluent you get in the language. And the thing about that is, once you know how to do that in one language, when you start learning a second language, it starts becoming a lot more easier, you'll find, or at least that's how I found it. So now, also something I'd like to leave you with is don't get frustrated when something's not coming easy for you. So maybe one person's result in how they learn Spanish isn't going to be the same for you because everybody learns languages at a different rate, and that's just how it is in general with learning in general. So don't get frustrated. If you're having a hard time in something, maybe switch to something else for a little bit, take a break, come back to it. Practice makes perfect, just keep practicing. really, it's going to take time to learn a language. It's not something that you learn overnight. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to comment, or if you want, you can send me a message via Instagram. Or if you are learning a language, feel free to check out my channel for more content, subscribe if you want, and I will catch you guys all on the flip side. Ciao.